Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. Earlier in this season of Extreme Reloading, we prepared a bunch of 5.56 cases and 9mm cases. We'll get back to the 9mm later, but we're focusing again on those rifle cases. We prepared those 5.56 rifle cases, primed them with Federal AR Match small rifle primers, and added a powder charge of 25.0 grains of Varget, which then was topped off by 62 grain Barnes TTSX bullets. Now that video of seating bullets and proper seating depth, that's going to come up here in just a little while, but today I wanted to take just a little bit of a break and talk more about powder. Specifically, how did I come up with that 25.0 grains of powder for that particular bullet? And the short answer to that is that I used optimal charge weight testing to arrive at that particular powder charge. But let's take the long way around that answer and talk about working up a load. Now, the first thing that you want to do, and we talked about this in the previous episode of Extreme Reloading, we want to know what is the minimum powder charge for the powder I want to use and the particular bullet that I'm going to be using also. We want to know the minimum and we need to know the maximum. We're going to work within those two bounds. So then you're going to want to work up that powder charge toward the maximum. Don't think that you have to go to the maximum all the time. You should have in your mind the goal that you have for this particular load that you're working up. If your goal is to push that bullet as fast as possible, okay, then you're going to want to see if you can load that powder charge at maximum and if your rifle can handle it. Normally that's not the goal that we have. Normally what we have is we want to have the most precise load worked up. Or we want to create some safe and reliable ammo for use out at the shooting range. In which case, punching through paper, those sorts of things, slapping a little bit of steel, you won't need a maximum powder charge. So we're going to work somewhere between that minimum and maximum. And in my particular case, I did want to achieve a reasonable muzzle velocity, a good muzzle velocity, but I wasn't necessarily interested, or really wasn't interested, in pushing that bullet to its maximum velocity possible. So start off with that. Okay, then what we're going to do is we have to increment our powder charge between that minimum and potentially to that maximum, or until we reach that goal. What is the increment? If round number 1 that you're going to fire and test is going to have the minimum powder charge in it, and remember once again, do not go ever below the minimum. Okay, what is round number 2? What's the powder charge in round number 2? So those increments that you can use, typically, if your goal is crafting safe and reliable ammo for some good target ammo, range ammo, then half grain increments, 0.5 grain increments works really, really well. I've used that for years when I was working up similar types of loads, and 0.5 grain increments works out really well. If you're more interested in the precision, then that half grain increment, lots of things can happen inside that half grain incrementation. And so normally what we do is we'll drop it down to 0.3 grain increments, or oftentimes normally for me when I'm working up a precise or precision rifle load, I will use 0.2 grain increments, working up toward that maximum or until I achieve the goals for this particular load. Now, the next thing that you have to decide is, are you going to load one round at each powder charge or more. There's advantages and disadvantages to each of those. Obviously, the disadvantage, if you load more than 1 round per powder charge or per increment, the disadvantage is you're going to burn a lot more powder. Not too much more, really, because you may be throwing 20-some grains for a 5.56, or you may be throwing 30, 40-some grains on a 308. That's not really too bad. And the advantage, though, of course, of firing or loading and firing more than one is you will be able to know a little bit more about the variability in that particular load. Your load number 1 at minimum charge, or load number 2 at minimum charge plus half a grain or plus 2/10 of a grain, whatever. So that's the advantage. So some folks like to, and sometimes I will, load 3 rounds per increment. And I know some folks who load 5 rounds per increment. That's okay too. I don't think I've ever done that, but I have certainly quite a number of times loaded 3 rounds per increment. Now, when you're out there at the range firing it, it's really, really beneficial to have a chronograph of some sort. I now use my lab radar chronograph. I really like that unit. It gives me excellent muzzle velocities, plus it gives me the velocity of that bullet downrange. And that's just an added bonus, I guess you'd say. But some sort of chronograph is really important. What you're going to look for on the chronograph are changes in velocity. What you should see, in theory, you should see load number 1 produces the lowest muzzle velocities, and as you increment it up, load number 2, a little bit more powder in it, a little bit more velocity as you go. Sometimes we will see it drop back down. That sometimes happens, not entirely uncommon. Now you're going to see want to see a nice linear progression, overall a linear progression in those muzzle velocities. What you don't want to see is a spike, a real rapid spike. You're moving along at a pretty reasonable rate. Maybe you're gaining 25 feet per second per powder charge, 25 feet per second again and again, and all of a sudden you get 80 feet per second jump. Uh-oh. Okay, what's going on here, right? We don't like to see those spikes. That's normally indicating that something's going on. Could be a number of different things, but you certainly would need to stop at that point, take a close look at those cases again, looking at the primers and so on. So what do we look at when we're firing these rounds and we're looking at those cases? So we're going to watch our chronograph, certainly, but I really recommend every round that you fire, you take a look at that case. Take a look at that case every round that you're firing. You may be hunting down cases if you're shooting a semi-auto, AR-15, AR-10s, those sort of things. But a bolt action, all the easier. Take a look at that thing. Take a look at the case, and the first thing I look at is the primer. The primer, when you first seat it, take a close look at it if you're not accustomed to this stuff, but take a close look at how it looks now. Or, just before you fire that, take a close look. What does it look like now? Normally what you're going to see is that primer is seated, obviously, with a nice recess. We talked all about that earlier. And the edges of the primer have this little rounded cup appearance that drops down just a little bit inside that primer pocket. You should see that. It should look like I'm explaining right now. Then you're going to fire that round. You're going to take a look at that chronograph. What kind of velocities are we getting? Take a look at that case. And if you notice that that primer has flattened out and it is just flush, and filling the entire primer pocket, it's like it somehow flowed into it, those sort of things, that means you've got some pressure, pretty high pressures. Sometimes, believe it or not, you will see that at your minimum powder charge. So don't worry about that too much at the minimum powder charge. if it's backing out, you see a whole bunch of other problems with it, that may not be okay. You may want to see what's happening with your rifle itself. But anyway, sometimes we do see a little bit of that early on. The next powder charge, you shouldn't be seeing any of that. And if you do start seeing it later on, it is because of high pressures that are happening. Normally, we pay attention to that primer on the head of the case. A couple of other things that you may notice about the primer. It may look nice, still rounded edges, all that good stuff. But what you might notice is some cratering around where the firing pin struck the primer. In other words, the metal of the primer itself is literally building like a crater wall around where the firing pin struck the primer. That's not a great sign either. So that would be an early indication that we may have some pressures starting to build up. So watch that. It doesn't mean you have to stop necessarily right there, but certainly make that mental note. And if then the next one you start flattening out primers and all that, then it's time to stop. You just don't say, well, I guess I better fire all the rest that I have here, No, because if it's too high a pressure, you're really going to ruin things. Okay, so there's a certain stopping point. The other stopping point is I've achieved my desired goals, right? I hit that velocity that I was looking for. No need to go any further than that. So that is a good reason, by the way, that's a good reason to load 1 round per powder charge, right, per increment. Fire those, determine that you have safe rounds all the way across, right? And then you might go back and load 3 more at each of those powder charges, or maybe a subset of those powder charges. And at that point, you might be looking for how well does these particular or individual loads, powder charges, how well are they grouping? What is the precision or dispersion for these particular loads? Now, there's 2 different ways, as I alluded to earlier, to assessing those powder charges. Which one really is the best? If we know that all of them are safe, well, which one is the best? Is it the fastest? Not necessarily, especially if your goal is precision, driving or creating a load with the lowest amount of dispersion. So the 2 ways that we approach this are, number 1, OCW, that is optimal charge weight. And the second way is what's called the ladder approach or ladder method. I normally don't use the ladder method. I haven't had a lot of success with the ladder method. It doesn't mean that it's not good. It's just that for me it hasn't really worked out that well. What has worked out really well for me is the optimal charge weight. Let me explain each of those. The optimal charge weight method goes like this. We're going to shoot these loads at these different increments. We're going to watch the velocities, and we're going to record those velocities. And what we're looking for is called the sill. As we graph those velocities, we might notice that we're getting this nice linear increase in velocity, but then it flattens out across a 0.2 of a grain powder charge increment or 0.3 of a grain. Normally, we will never be able to detect an optimal charge weight sill if we're using half grain increments. So using this method, you've got to use a 0.2 or 0.3 grain increment. We're looking for that sill. That is the place where this powder charge, or even 0.2 more, still gives me the same or almost the same muzzle velocity. That's really good because even if we have slight variations in the case capacity, maybe an undetectable difference in powder charge based on what your powder scale can throw and its tolerances, all those little differences that may actually be occurring don't matter. It doesn't matter because you're in that sill and you're still going to get the same muzzle velocities or awful similar muzzle velocities. So that's good. And this is a good way that I have used to drive down my standard deviation of muzzle velocities down to single digits. We can do it pretty frequently, pretty easily by following the optimal charge weight method. Now, as you're working things up, you may have more than one sill appear in your load workup. If you want a little bit more velocity and you want that OCW point, that sill, well then obviously you would take the second sill that appears. Now the ladder method, you should also be using relatively small powder grain increments, 0.2, 0.3 grain. Normally in ladder method we maybe go to a 0.3 instead of a 0.2. But you have to load more than one round at each of those powder charges. And so we're going to do 3, or maybe we're going to do 5. And now we're not going to pay so much attention to the velocities. We're going to pay attention to what's happening on target. And the important thing to do here is use the exact same point of aim throughout the entire process. Now again, you still got to watch for pressure problems and so on and so forth. Don't ignore that, okay? But with the ladder method, what we're studying then, with the exact same point of aim, the theory goes like this. That first group that I'm firing with the lowest powder charge is going to group down here, and then we're going to climb the ladder right up here. As muzzle velocity increases, it's going to tend to fly, in theory, tend to fly higher. And then the third group here, fourth group, whatever it happens to be, like this. That's in theory why it's called the ladder method, right? It's climbing the ladder. We don't really care that it climbs the ladder correctly like this. What we care about is what is the dispersion of those 3-shot or 5-shot groups at each of those steps, right? Sometimes it might behoove you to put a camera downrange and watch what's going on with each of those 3-shot groups, because if they start grouping close to one another, you won't know what it really did, right? So pay attention to that. Or have a good spotting scope on it, maybe at 100 yards or something, and make those notes at the bench what each of those loads is doing. And what you might notice is that at a certain powder charge, my groups are large, and at other powder charges, they're small. You also may notice that they go left and right, not just down and up, those sort of things. You may notice that, hey, for some reason, that group shot, nice group, but it went far to the right or far to the left. Same point of aim that was being used, you shot consistently. Why is that? Okay, it's barrel harmonics that are coming in there. And sometimes we'll see that. That's not a big problem. Don't sweat that. Don't kick out that group that has a tiny little group right over here, but it shot to the right. You can adjust that simply by adjusting the 0 on your scope. So that's what we're looking for. That's the ladder method in a nutshell. And in reality, you don't really have to choose OCW or ladder method. They're not really mutually exclusive, but you could use both. At the same time as you're working up that load, you're maybe going to use 0.2 or 0.3 grain increments, and you're going to shoot 3-shot groups. Well, what you might find is that I have a really nice, small dispersion for grouping number 4, and it also happened to be at an OCW sill. Well, now you have the best of both worlds, right? So understand the safety aspects of it. You're going to look for pressure problems as you're watching those velocities. And once again, here's the importance of having a chronograph. You're going to look at results. You might look at those grouping results with the ladder method especially, dispersion and precision on paper. And of course, you may be seeking the sill, looking for that point where the powder charge and even slightly different powder charges is going to give you effectively the same muzzle velocities. Well, that's a wrap for this episode of Extreme Reloading. If you've got some questions, post those in the comments below, and thank you for watching.